Thank you so much for that introduction. So great to be here with you. So I'm going to start off by admitting something that immediately loses me all street cred on the subject of soul food and barbecue. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. All right, wait, let me win you back. All right, so my parents are from the South. So my mom is from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad is from Helena, Arkansas. So this is the food that I grew up eating. So in this presentation, we're just going to go through the history of soul food. Going to talk about where the term soul food comes from, and then talk about kind of the early history of soul food, and then connect that with the Harlem Renaissance. And then I'm going to go through a typical soul food meal, and then give you my thoughts on the current trends in soul food. So first, let me tell you about my journey. Oh, and by the way, you are encouraged to do social media during this presentation. So if you like what's going on, just give a brother some love. If you're not liking it, you can hold off. There's no rush, right? So my journey. So grew up in Denver, went to Stanford undergrad. Then I went to Georgetown Law School, came back to Denver and practiced law for about 4 years. Now, this is not to disparage anybody who has attorneys in their family, or you want to be an attorney, maybe you are an attorney. It just wasn't for me. Got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. So, thanks for laughing at that, Coney. There's going to be more, I'm telling you. So I was going to open up a soul food restaurant. So if you're familiar with the Denver dining scene, I actually had the inside track on a place called Cuba Cuba on 12th and Delaware. So I had a chef, I was raising money, and then a friend of mine from Georgetown Law School reached out to me. She said, "Hey, Adrian, I'm back in DC. I'm working for President Clinton in the White House. Do you have any friends back in DC who might be interested in working in the White House?" And I said, "Well, tell me about the job." And so she worked on something called the President's Initiative for One America. And essentially that was an outgrowth of President Clinton's initiative on race. And the initiative on race had the core idea that if we just talked to one another and listened, we might realize that we have a lot more in common than what supposedly divides us. So that went on for a couple of years, and the group that was heading up the initiative on race said, "Mr. President, you need to have an ongoing office in the White House to deal with these issues of racial reconciliation." So that became the Initiative for One America. So when my friend told me this, I did the same thing that Dick Cheney did when George W. Bush asked him to find a vice president. I was the head of the search committee. My name was the only one put on the list. So got the job, went to the White House, loved it. My only quibble is there anyone here who's ever met President Clinton? Okay, could you just tell us what it was like to meet President Clinton?
He's really, really tall.
Really tall, okay. Anything else? Like, did he make you feel like you were the only person in the room? A lot of people say that.
Yeah, he really connects with everyone.
Yeah, so I worked for him for almost 2 years. I never got that. Every time I talk to the guy, I'm briefing him. It'd be like the first time. I'd say, "Mr. President," I get a blank look, kind of like the one you're giving me right now. I'm Adrian Miller, blank look. I work on your One America initiative. And then we say, "Oh, that's great." And then we would do whatever. So now, at the change of an administration, what happens if you're a political appointee? You have to actually write out your letter of resignation and submit it to the incoming administration. Shockingly, George W. Bush accepted my resignation, so I was out of a job. Now, at that point in my life, I actually had political ambitions. By this time, I wanted to be the senator from Colorado. So I was trying to get back to Colorado to start my political career, but the job market was really slow. I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows. And in the depth of my depravity, I said, "You know what, let me just read something." So I went to the bookstore, and I'm browsing the cookbook section because I like to cook, and I see a book called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History. And that was written by a guy named John Edgerton. And in that book, he said the tribute to African American achievement in cookery has yet to be written. So the book was about 10 years old, so I thought that was interesting. So I just emailed him out of the blue and asked him, "You wrote this 10 years ago, do you still think this is true?" He said, "Yeah, for the most part, nobody's taken on that story." And so with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that started the journey. So I did make it back to Denver. I was in politics at a think tank, and then I worked for Colorado's governor, and he decided not to run for re-election. So that's when I went all in on the soul food book. So to research this soul food book, I read 3,000 oral histories of formerly enslaved people and looked for all references for food. I read 500 cookbooks, read thousands of newspaper and magazine articles, because there are companies now that digitize and they're word searchable. So you can look at sources as far back as the 1500s. And then because I care about my subject so much, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants, 35 cities and 15 states. I know you're surprised I'm still alive. And if you were my Facebook friend, social media friend, I brought you along for the ride, because I'd take a picture of the restaurant and then the plate of food that I was eating. And I had so much information that I had enough to write 5 books. So I organized the soul food book this way. I created a representative soul food meal, and I wrote a chapter about every part of the meal, and I explained what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, what it means for the culture, and then most chapters end with recipes, traditional, health conscious, and then fancy ones in case you want to show off as a cook. So let me just quickly go through the meal. If you have any familiarity with soul food or with Southern food, please show your appreciation for these ingredients. I'm from the Black faith tradition, so I'm used to call and response. That's what we call it. So just, you can say amen or just applaud, whatever, okay? So entrees, fried chicken.
Amen.
All right, there you go. That's right, sister. All right, catfish.
Yes, Lord.
All right, chitlins. Okay, these are people who have had chitlins. So chitlins are pig intestines, not for everybody, usually stewed or fried. Okay, side dishes, greens. And in soul food culture, the popular greens are kale, collards, cabbage, turnip, and mustard. So if you've discovered kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party. We've been eating it for about 300. Black-eyed peas, candy jams, which are sweet potatoes, and mac and cheese. Then I wrote a chapter about cornbread, wrote a chapter about hot sauce, and then I wrote a chapter about red drink because I believe red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink. Now, you must understand, in soul food culture, red is a color and a flavor. We don't call things cherry or tropical punch or strawberry, it's just red. There is a generational shift happening, though. There are a lot of youngins that seem to like purple and blue. And as I write in my book, I do believe the children are our future, that we should teach them well and let them lead the way, but not on Kool-Aid because they're messing it up. And then for dessert, I couldn't settle on one, so I wrote about 4. Pound cake,
Yes.
peach cobbler, banana pudding, sweet potato pie. So that's the meal. So I was blessed to win the James Beard Award a year later. That's the highest accolade you can get in food writing. That's like winning an Oscar. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, thanks. So now while I was writing this book, I came across a few stories of African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. Now, I wish I had had this idea while I was in the White House because I could have gotten a lot of scoop, but of course I got it later. And I said, if I can just find enough stories, that would be my next book. And after doing some research, I identified 150 African Americans who have been in the presidential kitchen from President Washington to the present day. And I'm just scratching the surface because records were not adequately kept. And so in that book, I just wrote about categories of cooks. And that book did not win a James Beard Award, but I was nominated for an NAACP Image Award for Best Literary Nonfiction. Now, I knew I was not going to win because the civil rights advocate and activist and comedian Dick Gregory was in the same category, and he had died a few months earlier, so I knew I wasn't going to win anything. But I did get closer to a lifelong goal. I always wanted to meet Halle Berry, and she was a presenter that year. So as I was sitting way up in the balcony, squinting to see her when she came on stage, our eyes met, and I could tell we had a moment, and I felt a connection. So that is pretty much my writing career, so let's get in to talk about soul food. So you probably have heard the term soul food explained as something that, it really bubbles up in pop culture in the 1960s because there are these strong expressions of Black identity, the Black Power movement, Black is beautiful. But the earliest joining of the word soul and food in the English language actually goes back to Shakespeare. Does anybody know Shakespeare's first play? Two Gentlemen of Verona. I know it was on the tip of your tongue. And in that play, there are 2 female characters, Julia and Lucetta, talking about this real hunky guy named Proteus. So Proteus walks by in one scene, and Julia says to Lucetta, "Oh, knowest thou not that his looks are my soul's food? Pity the dearth that I've pined in by longing for that food so long a time." So from that, we know even in the late 16th century, not unusual for 2 girlfriends to get together and describe a guy as yummy. That's one takeaway. But we're really playing off the tangible and intangible, and that gets to the heart of the soul concept. But for the next 400 years, soul food is really religious in connotation. So it meant doing anything to edify your spiritual life. So it meant listening to a sermon, studying scripture, listening to hymns or singing hymns. Then it takes a musical turn later, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, if you're going to talk about African heritage people in the United States, most people trace our heritage to this band of countries along the western coast of Africa. I define the area by starting off with Senegal in the north, going all the way to Angola in the south. Now, in West Africa, the typical meal is some kind of starch with a savory soup, stew, or sauce, either served alongside of it or on top of it. And there are different starch traditions. So in Senegal, going all the way to kind of Sierra Leone, the starch tradition is rice. They have their own indigenous rice culture. Moving further along the coast, it's more grain. So it would have been sorghum and millet, and then eventually cornmeal when maize is introduced to the region. And then when you go further south, starting off with Ghana, kind of going all the way to Angola, it's more about root crops. So tropical yams, cassava, plantains, all right? Now there was a wonderful Nigerian restaurant in Denver, and this is a meal that I had there just to give you a sense of the kind of meal. So the thing on the, I guess on your left would be the, or sorry, your right, would be fufu. So fufu is really pounded yam that's pounded to the consistency of mashed potatoes. And then there's a tilapia fish steaks there, and then also just spinach, tomatoes, and chilies kind of making up that sauce. So the idea is you would break off a little of the fufu, get some of the fish in that sauce, and kind of scoop it up and eat it in one fell swoop. All right, this was delicious, but the place went out of business. I think it had something to do with the name. It was called the Palace Nigerian Food and Philly Cheesesteaks. This didn't work out. All right. Now here's a representation of the Middle Passage, and that's what was the nickname for the journey across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. It would last 10 to 12 weeks depending on where you left in Africa and where you disembarked in the Americas. Now the reason I show you this is first of all, during that 10 to 12 week journey, the enslaved who were kept below were below deck and only brought up twice a day for eating, exercise, and bathing. So a lot of the slave rebellions happened at that time. And then anywhere from 10 million to 25 million people made this journey across the Atlantic. We don't know for sure because records were not accurately kept. But this shows you kind of the flow of people. So only 4% of all of those millions of people come to the mainland North America, what would eventually become the United States and Canada. Most people go point south. So one of my arguments in my book is that soul food is really a European meal with West African influences. When you eat with a person of African heritage in the Caribbean, Latin America, or South America, you usually are eating an African meal with Western European influences. And a lot of that is because given the numerical superiority in other areas, the enslaved had more autonomy over their food. And there was also similar climates. So a lot of West African foods could be grown in the Americas, okay? In the early years of the slave trade, the enslaved were fed usually rotten European food, and the mortality rates got so high that slavers actually had to change their strategy to include the mortality rates. Because remember, it was just an economic game to them. They just wanted to unload enough of their human cargo in the Americas to make money. In fact, so what they did is they started feeding the enslaved the foods that they were used to from their whatever region of West Africa they were from. So if you knew that you had people down below from Senegal or Gambia, you would feed them rice-based dishes. Just to show you how horrible the conditions were on these ships, there are anecdotal stories of essentially sharks following slave ships all the way across the Atlantic because so many people were dying, they were just throwing bodies overboard. Gives you an idea of how horrific it was. This is just a newspaper advertisement from May 1st, 1769, just to show you that slavers were very cognizant of who they had below. This is a representation of kind of the food system during slavery. So essentially on the large plantations, the enslaved were given controlled amounts of food once a week. These were called rations. It would be 5 pounds of some starch, which would be either rice, cornmeal, or sweet potatoes, a couple of pounds of meat that was salted, smoked, or dried. Usually it was pork because that was the easiest thing to raise, and then a jug of molasses. So enslaved people had to figure out how to subsist by gardening, foraging, hunting, fishing, doing all kinds of things to supplement their diet. What we see in time is that the enslaved actually exercise a little bit of autonomy over their food. And so we see people from Senegal and Gambia asking for rice to be the starch that they're given every week. People from the middle part of the country or of the continent are asked to get cornmeal, which would be similar to the grain crops that they had, and then people from the more southern regions like Angola, Nigeria, they were asking for sweet potatoes. So we see that kind of replication. Here's an example of a plantation. So beyond the pasture area, that big square there would be the commodity crop would be grown, so that would be the cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo. But in the middle there, you see some numbers, and those numbers essentially are the slave cabins. But below that, it says Negro Gardens. So this shows, and then below that, it says poultry ground. So this shows you that the enslaved were actually given opportunities to grow their own food and raise their own animals. And in many cases, the plantation master would allow the enslaved people to go to town on the weekends and actually sell the extra produce or eggs or whatever that they have. And so in some cases, enslaved people bought their freedom because they had raised enough money from those sales. So that just gives you an idea of how they controlled their food. Typically, on a day on a plantation, the enslaved would be awakened just before dawn. They would be fed crumbled up cornbread and buttermilk out of a trough. They couldn't use any utensils, so they had to either use their fingers or clamshells. And the reason why they didn't have utensils is because utensils are potential weapons. And so in order to prevent any kind of slave rebellion, they banned the use of utensils. Then in the midday, the big meal was called dinner at that time. We call it lunch today, but it was called dinner in the 18th and 19th centuries. It would be seasonal vegetables, again, in a trough with some kind of pot liquor, which is basically the broth that the vegetables are boiled in, maybe some cornbread. Again, people had to use clamshells or fingers. And then supper, at the very end of the day, after all the work was done, was just the leftovers from that midday meal. So that was typical. So if you look at what the enslaved were eating during slavery, it's very close to what we call vegan today, because it was seasonal vegetables, it was water, things like dairy, enriched flour, and sugar. Those were all considered prestige ingredients, and the enslaved only had access to those on the weekends and special occasions. So just remember, a lot of what we think of with soul food, the fried chicken, the glorious cakes, those kind of things, that was celebration food. All right, so after emancipation, millions of African Americans leave the South for other parts of the country. This movement of people was called the Great Migration. It lasts for several decades, from the 1910s all the way to the 1970s. And it's one of the things that fuels the Harlem Renaissance. Now, remember, Harlem had a pre-existing black community. But the influx of Southerners and other people from around the country, because Harlem becomes this mecca, a cultural mecca, that really leads to a lot of the energy that we see in the Harlem Renaissance. So let's talk about food during the time of the Harlem Renaissance. So a lot of the poor people that arrived often had housing conditions where they didn't have a kitchen. And if the building did have a kitchen, you often had to pay for use of that kitchen. So it was called kitchen privileges. So a lot of time, these very poor migrants had to rely on other sources of food than what they could make at home. So street vendors were very, very important. So these were people that were selling a variety of products, and they were known for their distinctive street cries in order to attract customers. Another option were churches. We see a lot of churches, not only in Harlem, but across the South, as well in other parts of the country, often had dining options. In fact, a lot of churches ran restaurants in order to provide an eating option, a dining option for people who are part of their church and just the regular community. And then, of course, there are restaurants. Most of the restaurants that we read about in Harlem are essentially fried chicken places, fried fish places, and barbecue places. There are a few soul food places, and then also there are a lot of Chinese restaurants. In the 1920s, Chinese food was very, very popular. The go-to dish was called chop suey, but later on you'll see things like soul rolls, which are soul food egg rolls. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as part of a continuation of that culture. So let's talk about soul food. Well, how does that really get the connotation that it has today? Well, in the 1920s, during the Harlem Jazz era, you had a lot of African American artists who were miffed. And they were miffed because they felt that white jazz artists were getting the most publicity, making the most money, and it was almost like white jazz artists had created this musical genre. So the black jazz artists decided to take this music to a place where they thought white musicians could not mimic the sound. And that was the sound of the black church in the rural South. So in the late 1940s, early 1950s, a gospel-tinged jazz sound emerges, and people called that soul and funky. So soul becomes the most popular. So it's soul music first, not in a religious context, but in this popular jazz context. And then it's soul brothers, soul sisters, soul food, because it gets slapped on other aspects of the culture. So we could easily be calling this food funky food, but that's not popular, right? That's not what caught on. But what does happen in the 1960s is soul becomes racialized and radicalized. So Black Power advocates in the 1960s, still carrying on the cultural momentum from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, are trying to figure out, well, now how do we connect all of these people around the country who are black folks having different experiences, but they can relate to what others are going through. So they often use culture as a way to connect people, and food is a powerful connector. So a manifesto from some Black Power advocates was leaked to the New York Times, and it said white people cannot understand things like ham hocks, cornbread, and listed all these other kind of Southern soul food items. Now this was news to white Southerners because they'd been eating the same food for 200 years, but soul becomes black and Southern becomes white. And we're still living with the legacy of that today. So if I were to ask you, hey, name somebody on TV who's known for soul food, who would you say? Don't feel bad if you're struggling. Okay, no one really comes to mind. Okay, now if I said, name someone on TV known for Southern food, Paula Deen, her kids, Trisha Yearwood, there's a whole long list. So one of the vibrant discussions right now is trying to reconcile this and really bring the African-American contributions to Southern food back into the conversation. All right, so I talked about my national eating tour, so I'm gonna give you some of the highlights as we go through a typical soul food meal. So I talked about chicken, either fried or smothered. If you're not familiar with smothered chicken, it's essentially getting chicken, you butcher it up, you flour it and do a quick sear, and then you braise it in gravy until it just falls apart into deliciousness. This place is called Deborah's Kitchen in Philadelphia. This is kind of fried chicken I like. It's a thin, well-seasoned, papery crust. When you place your order, you hear some sizzling happening, so you know you're getting something fresh made to order. And then when you bite into it, it's just really juicy meat on the inside, so really good stuff. Fried fish. Now, I talked about catfish, and catfish is one of the most popular soul food items because catfish is so easy to raise. In fact, in the 1960s, there was a problem with the cotton crop, and so the market just kind of collapsed. So a lot of black cotton farmers just basically flooded their fields and started raising catfish. So catfish was really cheap, and any cheap fish will do, and typically it's fried. And the way you do it is you skin or scale the fish, and then you season it with cornmeal, and then you fry it. Now, today, you don't see catfish as much in soul food restaurants because the catfish industry is going through some difficult times. So catfish is now expensive. In fact, a lot of times in Denver, catfish is more expensive than salmon. And so now you're seeing a lot of restaurants use tilapia or Vietnamese catfish called basa xoai. That's what you're starting to see substituted. Variety meats. So variety meats are those funky cuts of meat like ham hocks, oxtails, turkey necks, all of those things. That was a hallmark of soul food until whole animal cooking was recently discovered by fine dining chefs. So now, instead of going to these soul food restaurants, you're in these other restaurants. And I've seen things like this happen. You know, you'll be in a restaurant, somebody will eat some, let's say, pig feet. Now, pig's feet are called pig's feet in soul food joints, but in a restaurant, they're called trotters. So you'll see somebody eating trotters and they're like, oh, the chef is so amazing, just taking us to places we've never been before with food, honoring the whole animal. It's just amazing. And then you pay $30 for something that's like, should be $5. Chitlins, I talked about pig intestines. I only eat chitlins 2 times a year, Thanksgiving and New Year's Day. My brother's shaking his head. He's like, never. All right. Greens, I talked about greens earlier. Now this is a place called Bully's Soul Food in Jackson, Mississippi. Now the reason I love Bully's Soul Food is that this table is right off the main dining room. So while you're eating your meal, somebody periodically comes out and strips greens and peels sweet potatoes. So you just know you're getting the real deal. Black eyed peas, this is from Marcus Samuelson's place in Harlem called Red Rooster. If you're a fan of Food TV, the Food Network, he's a popular chef there. So now my soul foodies or my southern foodies, why would I have greens and black eyed peas on the same slide?
That's the wealth and prosperity for the new year.
For the new year. Okay, so you eat greens for? Money, folding money, right? And then you eat black eyed peas for? Luck. Now, in some places they say that the black eyed peas are for coins. In fact, in the places where this happens, it's not unusual that somebody will say, you're extra lucky if you get the dime. They put a dime in the pot and cook it, and if you're extra lucky if you get that dime. Now, I think that's dangerous, but this is kind of like the king's cake with Mardi Gras, you know, so it's kind of the same idea. Now, the other thing that bothers me about that tradition is by now they should have adjusted for inflation. Should be a quarter at least. Candy jams. Now, what we call yams in this country are dark flesh sweet potatoes. And this is really just a marketing ploy by some Louisiana farmers in the 1920s. They wanted to create a sweet potato that would be distinguished in the market, so they engineered this darker flesh, sweeter content sweet potato, and they called it yams. So that's why you can go to the store and there'll be a big bin at Thanksgiving time, and you'll have these light-colored sweet potatoes, and it says sweet potatoes, and then you have these dark-colored sweet potatoes, and they'll call them yams. Basically the same thing. So the way you make candy jams, you can either boil or bake them, and then you just braise them in a sweet gravy of butter, sugar, cinnamon, all kinds of good stuff. Macaroni and cheese. Now, I was not going to include macaroni and cheese in my book because I thought it was just too universal, but so many of my black friends threatened to slap me upside the head that I just succumbed to peer pressure. Here's the thing. Macaroni and cheese goes way back. The earliest recipe we have written down is from the go-to cookbook for Queen Elizabeth I and Richard II. So in that early recipe, mac and cheese was essentially the noodles, sprinkle on Parmesan cheese, and butter. It's only over time that we start to add the cream elements to the goopy mess that it is today. The way it gets into black cooking is essentially it starts out as royalty food, and then it becomes kind of wealthy people's food, and then wealthy Americans that go to Europe get exposed to the dish. People like Thomas Jefferson, they bring it back to the South, and their enslaved cooks are the ones who regularly make this dish for others, and that's how it becomes part of African American cooking, because there's really not much dairy in West African cooking, so this was an adoption. Soul food cornbreads, we certainly have wheat breads, but I think the cornbreads are the most emblematic. If I make cornbread for you at my house, I'm going to make it in a cast iron skillet. You're going to get a nice buttermilk cornbread with a nice crisp crust on the bottom. I'm going to give you a nice wedge. Muffins, cornbread, and hush puppies. You all know the story about hush puppies, right? For those who don't know, so hush puppies are little fried balls of cornmeal. So the story goes is that there were some people out doing some work by a river, and it became mealtime, and they caught some fish. They're frying up the fish, and the dogs that they brought with them smell that fish frying, and they're yelping. So somebody decides to take a little bit of the extra cornmeal that they used to season the fish, moistened it, balled it up, fried it, and then took it out and gave it to the dogs to hush the puppies. So at your next cocktail party, if conversation gets slow, you can drop that one. This is from a place called Hard Knocks Cafe, which is an Asian American run soul food joint in San Francisco. Good stuff if you're ever in the area. Hot sauce, okay, Tabasco is the world's best-selling hot sauce. I'm not a huge Tabasco fan, doesn't have enough kick for me, but it's the world's best-selling hot sauce. There's also, moving to the left here, you've got pepper vinegar. Now, pepper vinegar is a renewable resource. So what people would do is they would get a container, you drop your chilies in there and just add the vinegar, and then you just steep it until it gets to the level of spice that you want. Then you put it on your vegetables, and then when that vinegar runs out, just pour more in there. Just wait till it gets to the spice level you want and use it over and over. But I like the red hot sauces. I like Frank's and Louisiana brand. Those are my favorites. Crystal is a favorite among New Orleans chef, and essentially that's where you get the cayenne peppers, the red cayenne peppers, you mash them up, add some vinegar and your spices, and then you let that steep. Believe it or not, hot sauce was thought of as medicine in the 1700s and 1800s. If you had strep throat in the late 1700s, you would actually get a recipe from the doctor to do a capsicum gargle. Capsicum is the botanical name for these chilies. And essentially, they would mash up the chilies and add vinegar, and you would gargle with that to get rid of the strep throat. Turn around any bottle of hot sauce, what are the ingredients? Chilies, vinegar, and spices. So basically, you're gargling with hot sauce. Red drinks, we talked about that earlier. There are two ancestral red drinks that come across the Atlantic that you've probably had and didn't even know it. The first one is cola. You're probably like, what are you talking about, man? All colas are brown. Well, if you look at the bottle or can of cola, they're all dyed brown. In fact, cola nuts are native to West Africa. They're either white or reddish in color. And typically, if you went to somebody's house in certain parts of West Africa, you would be offered something called a red cola nut tea. So they would get some water, drop the cola nuts in there, and sweeten it to taste, and that would be the drink you would have. The other is hibiscus. Hibiscus is a plant native to West Africa. Again, they make a hospitality drink called bissap, and essentially that's water, put the flower petals in, sweeten it to taste. Bissap comes across the Atlantic, takes root in Jamaica. So if you have Caribbean heritage, there's something called sorrel. It's a Christmas time drink because that's when the flower blooms in Jamaica. And then it makes its way around Latin America. So if you go to a taqueria and you have agua de Jamaica, Jamaica water, you're drinking bissap. It's just a riff off that West African drink. So to me, the reason why I said red drink is the official, red Kool-Aid is the official drink, is I think that it's the same formula as these drinks, right? Get some water, color it red or whatever color, sweeten it to taste. I put sweet tea on here because whenever I do my presentations around the country, people want to argue with me about why didn't I include this or that. I don't think sweet tea is part of the soul food canon. Now, inside the South, it's different. In fact, the differences between soul and Southern inside the South are almost meaningless. But once you get outside the South, the differences sharpen pretty quickly and decisively. And you really don't see sweet tea in a lot of soul food restaurants. Now, the other thing that's happening is I think sweet tea is starting to lose its Southern identity because of McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, all of these chains are now serving sweet tea. And I think people are not going to think of it as Southern pretty soon. And my exhibit one for that is Coca-Cola. 100 years ago, people thought of Coca-Cola as a Southern drink. Nobody thinks of that now because Coca-Cola was so effective at making it into a worldwide drink. And I think sweet tea is on its way. When I do have sweet tea, I do like it strong. I like the kind of sweet tea where the spoon stands up straight because it has so much sugar in it. Okay, not that much. All right, soul food desserts. Most of the soul food desserts are actually riffs off old British desserts. So if you have sweet potato pie, look at the recipes from the 1600s for carrot pie. It's the same method and the same spicing. So I think it's just a cook swapping out one sweet orange root crop for another, swapping out carrots for sweet potatoes. Peach cobbler. Peach cobbler emerges in the mid-1800s. The way they made it back in the days, you'd have a big cast iron pot. You would put the peaches in whole with the pits, add your butter, sugar, or whatever, and then you would put on leftover biscuit dough, and then you would put the lid on top. So you have the fire underneath cooking the fruit filling, and then you would take coals and put it on the lid to cook that top layer. And because it was biscuit dough, people thought that it looked like cobblestones from a street, and so that's why they called it cobbler. The interesting thing is when you get towards the late 1800s, the pits come out of the recipes, and that's when almond extract and vanilla extract start getting added. So I think that's a cook's attempt to approximate the taste left by the pits. Banana pudding, okay, I'm burying myself because this is a banana pudding that I made. You can tell my meringue game is not tight. I know that. I'm working on it. But banana pudding is a riff off an old British dessert called a trifle. And a trifle had a bread component and a cream component. So the bread here is the vanilla wafer cookies, and the cream is the custard you would make for your banana pudding. And then there's pound cake. Please just pay attention to the pound cake. I was at an all-you-can-eat place, and they were about to close the dessert portion of it, so I just grabbed everything. So just focus on the pound cake. But old British dessert, pound of sugar, pound of flour, pound of sugar. And that was the old cakes. And that, I find soul food cooks are most proud of their pound cake recipes. Those are the hardest ones to get. And I think because it's so simple, you can really put your individuality and show off your virtuosity as a cook. So I think that's why it's so hard to get those recipes. But if you're a good cook, please just share your recipes. All right, our graveyards are full of fantastic recipes. There's no reason to take it with you. All right, share it. All right, soul food innovation, some recent trends. Chicken and waffles. Now this has a direct tie to the Harlem Renaissance. You all have had chicken and waffles, right? Are you all feeling chicken and waffles? Okay. So the story is that this guy named Joseph Wells, during the Harlem Renaissance era, he noticed that a lot of people were coming out of the jazz clubs at 2 in the morning, too late for dinner, too early for breakfast. So he decided to create this hybrid dish called chicken and waffles. It's a great story, but it's not true. The earliest chicken and waffle tradition comes from old Europe. German immigrants come to Pennsylvania, take root in the countryside, and they had a creamed chicken and waffle tradition. We call them Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's Pennsylvania Deutsch. So creamed chicken and waffles goes to Philadelphia where it becomes high class. So in the 1790s, people were eating catfish and waffles and this creamed chicken and waffles dish. But it goes south and the creamed chicken becomes fried chicken. So cats like Thomas Jefferson and other people on a weekend breakfast, they would actually serve you fried chicken with any kind of hot bread. And that hot bread could be a waffle, could be a pancake, could be a biscuit, could be a roll or anything. Now for the next 100 years, chicken and waffles is a high-end kind of wealthy white person's dish. But then in the early 1900s, it falls out of favor. Now this happens with food, right? Things fall in and out of favor. And I think the falling out of favor created the space for Joseph Wells to put out that marketing myth. It was very effective because a lot of people still believe this to this day. In fact, people fight with me online for even telling you this. In fact, a lot of my black fans got mad at me when I revealed the true history of chicken and waffles because they were convinced like rock and roll and other things, white people stole it from black people. But I said, no, we stole it first, it's just going back home. Now, this is something that might upset your appetite, so that's why I give you this warning. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kool-Aid pickle, known as the Kool-Ickle. Have any of you ever had a Kool-Ickle? Okay, did you like them?
As a child,
As a child, all right. Where did you grow up?
I grew up here.
Okay,
I
interesting.
would go to my grandmother's house this summer.
All right, and where was your grandmother's house?
Arkansas.
Okay, all right. I was gonna say, have you had them here? All right.
Conway.
So here's how you make a Kool-Aid pickle. You get a jar of kosher dill pickles, open up the jar, take the pickles out, poke holes in the pickle or cut them, and then you make Kool-Aid out of the pickle brine, put the pickles back in, close the jar, and wait 2 weeks. Are you okay? You're looking kind of peaked. You all right? Okay. 2 weeks later, you take the pickles out of the jar and eat them. If you like the taste of pickles and of Kool-Aid, it's just a sweet and sour combination. If you don't like either one of those things, it's one of the nastiest things you'll ever put in your mouth. So the question is like, where does this come from, right? And so in talking to elders, what I found out as little kids, they did this, the peppermint pickle. So what they would do is they would go to the corner store, the gas station, they would get those big pickles in the jar, they would take them out, cut the tip off, and then they would put hard candies in the soft part of the pickle. And they would let the pickle juice dissolve the candy, and then they would suck on it. So I think that's just the same sweet and sour combination. So all of these, and then some of the really hardcore people, they would take things like Pixie Sticks or Kool-Aid powder, and they would just pour it on the pickle and just munch on it. That's pretty hardcore, but some people did that. Nashville hot chicken. You all know about Nashville hot chicken? So this is one of the crazes in soul food. Now, the thing that fascinates me about Nashville hot chicken is the origin story. The story is that there was this known womanizer, and true to form, he cheats on his woman. She was a good cook, so she decided to get back at him by making his favorite thing, fried chicken, but she wanted to make a super spicy version of it to burn his mouth out. So she does this, dude takes one bite and loves it. So they end up opening up a restaurant. It's called Prince's Hot Chicken. It exists to this day. This is how hot the chicken is. Somebody made a documentary of the restaurant, and this loyal customer says that he goes there and he buys the hottest version of the chicken. Now, when you order the hottest version, they yell out to the kitchen, "Dead man" or "Dead woman walking." That's how they queue up the order. And then he brings it home. He draws a bath of ice cold water. He puts ice cubes in the bathtub. He gets in and then he eats it. That's how hot it is. LA, if y'all are anybody here from LA gets the prize for the weirdest soul food. So this is a place called Tony's Soul Burgers, not too far from the former Fabulous Forum in Inglewood, California, that has a soul food hamburgers. So this was the Thanksgiving burger that I had. Bun, whole wheat bun, turkey patty, a layer of cornbread dressing, a layer of collard greens, a layer, she's nodding, a layer of sweet potato casserole, a layer of cranberries, whole wheat bun. Awesome. Then I had a soul food hot dog. Here's a soul food hot dog. Bun, wiener, collard green and cucumber relish, sweet potato puree drizzle, crumbled bacon bits, slammin'. The restaurant, if you ever watched the show Good Times, they had a mural of when the credits were rolling during Good Times, so it's the exact replica of that mural, except everybody has a hot dog instead of a pool cue. Both of these places closed. Can you believe that? I know. All right, let's talk about soul food trends. So in addition to traditional soul food, you have something called down-home healthy soul food. And the idea there is that soul food is unhealthy, it needs a warning label, it's gonna kill you if you eat it on a regular basis. I challenge that notion because if you think about what nutritionists are telling us to eat, they're telling us to eat more dark leafy greens, more sweet potatoes, more fish, hibiscus, okra, these are all superfoods. These are all the building blocks of soul food. But some people are consciously taking soul food to a different place, so you would cut back on the fat, the salt, and the sugar. So this is Creole broiled catfish. This is one of the recipes in my book. So the way you make it is you get a catfish fillet, rub it with olive oil, then put on your favorite Creole spice, just broil it for 7 minutes till it's just opaque. People go nuts for this. This recipe was contributed by an ex-girlfriend, so I want to pause and offer a pro tip. If you are dating or married to a good cook, I encourage you to stay with that person. But if you notice that the relationship is starting to get rocky, I can just tell you from personal experience, it's a lot easier to get the recipes before you break up. Now, upscale soul food is the exact opposite. So you're doubling down on using like duck fat, really expensive ingredients, heirloom vegetables, heritage meat. So it's just the opposite trend. But the strongest trend right now is vegan. And I went to a place called Solely Vegan in, have you been there? Yes. Okay, I went to a place called Solely Vegan in Oakland, California. So moving from left to right, southern fried tofu, vegan mac and cheese, and vegan collard greens with a cayenne pepper lemonade. So the tofu was shaped to look like fried chicken. To me, in terms of taste and texture, it reminded me more of catfish, but I thought it was good. The vegan mac and cheese, because there's no dairy in vegan, right? So it was made with almond milk. To me, it had the consistency of stuffed tortellini, so it was really more of a hard kind of mac and cheese. So I wasn't feeling it as much, because I think mac and cheese, I'm thinking creamy, but it still tasted good. And then the collard greens were as good as any collard greens I've had, because if you know how to season, you can season vegetables where you don't even need the meat. Most soul food restaurants now, despite their reputation, are vegan with their side dishes. So and it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to get the broadest customer base, having vegan sides makes a ton of sense. So this is the biggest trend in soul food. And when I tell people that they often say, well, look, that's an oxymoron. Vegan soul food, it doesn't even make sense. But remember what I said about what enslaved people are eating. So it's really not a departure from soul food. In many ways, it's a homecoming. There's fusion going on, so you're seeing soul food being mixed with other cuisines. In Atlanta, Georgia, there's a place called the Blaxican. That's his name, not mine. And he has something called collard green quesadillas. They're actually very, very good. Another thing that you're seeing a lot is soul rolls. So these are soul food egg rolls. And there's actually a rich history here because Chinese immigrants were one of the first group of restaurateurs to welcome blacks to actually sit down in any of their restaurants. Most restaurateurs were racist and drew a color line, and so black customers were usually only allowed to have takeout. So this resonated deeply within the black community. So there's always been a long time love affair with Chinese food. So the soul roll is this. You take an egg roll wrapper and you put soul food ingredients inside. So this is a smothered chicken soul roll. So it has the chicken, gravy, and rice. This is actually from Cora Faye's in Aurora. So I showed a picture of where the chicken and waffles are from. So she's got a collard green one, she's got a sweet potato one, and a mac and cheese one. She says the mac and cheese one is probably the biggest seller. And then finally, I want to talk about soul food in space. So you may not know this, but periodically there's a group of people living on a volcano in Hawaii, and they live there for 6 months at a time because the soil on that volcano is very similar to the soil on Mars. So they're trying to replicate conditions if there is a peopled colony on Mars. So they live in this self-contained unit, and then when they leave, they have to wear a spacesuit because, again, you're thinking about psychology and other things. So you want to get as close to those situations as possible. But if you look at the food that they're experimenting with, a lot of it is soul food. They're looking at greens. They're looking at sweet potatoes, hibiscus, and okra. The reason why? Any one-way trip to Mars is going to take a year, maybe even more, to get there one way. There's no way that you could put all of the food that you need on your spaceship and escape Earth's atmosphere. So they're going to have to figure out how to grow food along the way. And that's where soul food comes into play. So I actually had an event in Houston, and I reached out to Johnson Space Control, because that's where they do a lot of the experimenting with food and testing. And I called them up and I said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about soul food in space. Believe it or not, they didn't hang up. They said, hey, yeah, come on. We'll give you a tour and we'll talk to you about that. So it was fascinating. And I did see a lot of the prospects for soul food in space that I'd share with you. But I learned about a couple of non-starters. So one is cornbread. Does anybody know why cornbread would be a non-starter in space? What does cornbread do? Okay, yeah, it does rise, but after it's already cooked, what does it do? Crumbles. So in a zero gravity environment, your spaceship's going to be straight nasty because you're just going to have crumbs everywhere. And then the other thing is that I found out that chitlins are a non-starter in space because you can't roll down the window. Anyway, so thank you so much for joining me for this journey through soul food. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book is I saw all these other cuisines being celebrated, and I thought, well, why not my food? Why are people always hating on my food? And the two biggest criticism of soul food is, one, it needs a warning label. The stuff is going to kill you if you eat it consistently, and I think that's unfair because a lot of the foundations of soul food are healthy. And I think if you look at what African Americans are eating on the whole, a lot of it is this junk food and convenience food, and there are also environmental factors that are affecting our health outcomes. So I think soul food is getting an unfair rap. And the second part was that, this is slave food, it's poverty food, it's just not worth celebrating. But as this presentation has shown you, a lot of soul food's history is complex. It's the fusing of West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas, and there's a multi-class dimension to soul food. So I just don't think soul food needs to be hated on. I just think it needs more love. Thank you.
You mentioned how sort of the trend towards vegan soul food is almost coming full circle, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts or guesses around what may be coming next, or if there's any other directions that.
So I think what's coming next is already here is that fusion. So you're seeing a lot of people playing with different cuisines and fusing in soul food ingredients. So it's kind of like unusual stuff, but still familiar. I think that's the main thing that's happening now. For a long time, you had a generation that was kind of lost with soul food because there was a kind of a rupture of home cooking. And so I think with the rise in celebrity culture and the interest in food, a lot of those people that maybe lost interest in food are starting to reconnect with it. So I think we're going to have to see a lot more cooking happen. But I think the fusion is the hot thing right now.
So you touched on this at the very end about like health food, and what's the impact of food deserts on soul food culture and like distributing knowledge across different generations?
Right, so that's a great question. That's why I think soul food is getting a bad rap, because we have a lot of people in food deserts, and because there's less home cooking happening. I don't know how many people are actually eating soul food on the regular. I think they're eating all this other stuff. And so one of the most vibrant things that are happening right now is the food justice movement. So you're finding people that are trying to get people to garden in their own yards. And believe it or not, cities really clamp down on that. Like, you own your yard and they make it hard to turn your front yard into a garden. So there's a lot of activity there. You're starting to see churches actually play a lot more in the food justice movement. So getting their congregations to eat healthy food. There's actually a pastor, a black pastor in northern Mississippi, who banned fried chicken at church functions. This pastor is still alive and still has his job. But yeah, you know, it took a lot of leadership. But he was looking at his congregation. He's like, I have to minister to not only their souls, but their bodies and their health as well. So you're starting to see a lot of churches garden. And gardening's not easy. It's hard work. So that you're starting to see more assertion of autonomy and food sovereignty and all of these things happening at the micro level. So I think it's pretty exciting stuff. Yeah, it's just, you know, it's hard. So we just have to see if people are going to stick with it. Because there's a lot of energy at first to start these ideas, but just to keep them going is not so easy.
A lot of what you talked about is soul food in America. When you talk about the trends and seeing more fusions, can you talk a little bit about soul food in Asia or soul food in Europe? Do we see examples of people opening up American-style soul food, and what type of twist do they put on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the unheralded stories of soul food is the extent to which GIs, after they do their military service, stay abroad, because they don't want to come back to the United States because it's so racist. So you have, like, at the height of the Vietnam War, there was actually a soul food restaurant in Saigon that, for whatever reason, the Vietnamese I guess they kind of understood why black people were there, and like they were kind of forced to be there. And so they would never really attack this restaurant. So there was this vibrant soul food restaurant that could sell a lot of soul food items because there's a common culinary vocabulary with Southeast Asian cuisines. So they could get chitlins, they had mustard greens, they could get catfish, you know, all of these things. So you see that happening. One of the most famous soul food restaurants outside of the United States was in Paris, started by a former football player and GI named Leroy Haynes. He ends up opening up this restaurant in Montmartre, part of Paris, which during the Harlem Renaissance was a place that people often looked to. You know, a lot of jazz artists from the United States, would go to Paris. And so that became a cultural center for Europe. So a lot of stars would roll through there. Brigitte Bardot, who was this big French star, said that the chitlins there were formidable, slamming. So you see a lot of that. I think the interesting thing that's happening now is that as we're starting to explore cuisines around the world, what you see is that West Africa gets ignored. When people talk about African cuisines, they're usually talking about the North, so more Middle Eastern, Egypt, and then South Africa. But you don't see a lot of discussion of East African food and West African food. So I think one frontier that's just waiting to be explored with American diners is especially West African food. I don't know if you're a fan of kind of Top Chef in these shows, but we've had some young African chefs who are now getting prominent. In fact, I'm going to butcher his name, so I'm not even going to mention, but there's one chef in New York who's opened a restaurant. He won James Beard Award. Kwame is his first name. I'm just going to butcher his last name. But he won the Rising Star Chef James Beard Award, and he put out a book, and it's already been optioned into a movie. So I think West African food may have a moment. But it's really GIs and jazz artists that kind of open up soul food restaurants all around the world. And they have a strong reputation in those communities. So that's one story I hope I can tell more. I've told the GI story a little bit, especially in my book, but I really want to find more of these restaurants.
And so in terms of the local restaurants in Colorado, when we're thinking Black-owned restaurants, when we're thinking restaurants that focus on Black cuisine, why do you think there is a consistent amount of turnover or closure with a lot of those restaurants in our community?
So I think the first, it's just hard to run a restaurant. Any restaurant, making it past the 3-year mark is significant. But traditionally, Black entrepreneurs have had a lack of access to capital. So in many instances, they're running into that situation, or they're starting that situation kind of halfway closed, because they really don't have adequate capital to maintain the physical plant of their restaurant. Historically, we've seen that black entrepreneurs have been limited to the parts of town where they can have restaurants. It's not so much the case today, although the limits are more imposed by money than actual law. But for example, most black neighborhoods and black businesses are on the east side of town. And there's historical reasons for that, because the prevailing winds blow from west to east. So the pollution would go eastward, right? So that's usually, that's where black people were and marginalized communities were set. So, and often they were at the very edge of town. So it was just hard to get customers. So I think the lack of customers, lack of capital, and also what I would term is just more consistent harassment for regulatory things. I mean, I think all of that just really creates a lot of hurdles for black entrepreneurs. Today, I would say it's really gentrification. So these neighborhoods sometimes, and I think there's two situations. One is where black entrepreneurs are in a neighborhood that's gentrifying, so the rents go up, so they have to just close up shop and go someplace else if they're going to continue their business. And then the other situation you have restaurants that started on the edge of town, but the city has grown towards them, and zoning gets changed and other things, and that ends up closing places. We see this mostly with black barbecue restaurants, because we're smoking, right? So, and when the new neighbors show up, they're like, oh, there's too much smoke, you got to cut that. And so we see a lot of black businesses closing down. Yeah.
And with all that being said, are you still considering opening a restaurant?
No, because I'm too lazy.
Okay.
So, I can see myself consulting and maybe, depending on where a restaurant was, maybe finding out the black culture, food culture of that area, and having that inform the menu and giving it a kind of a cool vibe. But the day in and day out of working in a kitchen,
Not interested?
nah,
Okay.
not anymore.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Unrelated to food, but I know you said at the very beginning you were reconsidering your political career. Are you still thinking about that part of your business, or moving forward?
Yeah, I'm just moving on from that. I'm just way too nice. So, I wouldn't only make it so far in politics today. And the other thing is, I'm about getting some stuff done. And I don't think that's the vibe that we have now. In fact, it seems like the incentives is not to get things done. And I want to be in it to solve problems. And we have some serious challenges that we're facing. So it's just killing me that all this energy is being placed in other directions. And the other thing is just the fundraising would be just too soul crushing. I guess the other factor is too many ex-girlfriends. You never know who's going to be. I'm just kidding.
And so in general, what's next for you?
So I'm now working on a book on the history of African American barbecue. The working title is Black Smoke. That's tight, huh?
I like it.
Yeah, okay. And the reason is, if you look at food media today, you wouldn't even know that black people barbecue. It's typically a certain type of person is being celebrated in barbecue, and I have to show the history, because barbecue, as we understand it, is Native American in origin. Before 1800, people talk about barbecue as cooking in the Indian manner, but by the time you get to the 1850s, it's strongly associated with black cooks. So much so that there are recipes in media that have black people as part of the recipe. Like, you have to have a colored man do this, and that's part of the barbecue recipe. So I want to show that heritage and say, look, if you're going to talk about barbecue in this country, you got to talk about black people.
You got to include us.
Yes.
Shout out to Kansas City.
Yes. That's my favorite style, actually.
Well, thank you so much for coming. We greatly appreciate it. Next up is the macaroni and cheese class. If you guys are signed up, there's a long wait list, but if you made it in, it's going to be amazing. But one more round of applause.
Thank you.